Hello everyone. Today we'll be reading the fourth chapter in the social science textbook in history for class 10, The Age of Industrialization. In 1900, a popular music publisher, E.T. Paul, produced a music book that had a picture on the cover page announcing the dawn of the century. As you can see from the illustration, at the center of the picture is a goddess-like figure, the Angel of Progress, bearing the flag of the new century. She is gently perched on a wheel with wings, symbolizing time. Her flight is taking her into the future. Floating about behind her are the signs of progress: railway, camera, machines, printing press, and the factory. This glorification of machines and technology is even more marked in a picture which appeared on the pages of a trade magazine over 100 years ago. It shows two magicians. The one at the top is Aladdin from the Orient, who built a beautiful palace with his magic lamp. The one at the bottom is the modern mechanic, who, with his modern tools, weaves a new magic, builds bridges, ships, towers, and high-rise buildings. Aladdin is shown as representing the East and the past. The mechanic stands for the West and modernity. These images offers us a triumphant account of the modern world. Within this account, the modern world is associated with rapid technological change and innovations, machines and factories, railways and steamships. The history of industrialization thus becomes simply a story of development, and the modern age appears as a wonderful time of technological progress. These images and associations have now become part of popular imagination. Do you not see rapid industrialization as a time of progress and modernity? Do you not think that the spread of railways and factories and construction of high-rise buildings and bridges is a sign of society's development? How have these images developed? And how do we relate to these ideas? Is industrialization always based on rapid technological development? Can we today continue to glorify continuous mechanization of all work? What has industrialization meant to people's lives? To answer such questions, we need to return to the history of industrialization. In this chapter, we will look at this history by focusing first on Britain, the first industrial nation, and then India, where the pattern of industrial change was conditioned by colonial rule. Before the Industrial Revolution. All too often, we associate industrialization with the growth of factory industry. When we talk of industrial production, we refer to factory production. When we talk of industrial workers, we mean factory workers. Histories of industrialization very often begin with the setting up of the first factories. There is a problem with such ideas. Even before factories began to dot the landscape in England and Europe, there was large-scale industrial production for an international market. This was not based on factories. Many historians now refer to this phase of industrialization as proto-industrialization. In the 17th and 18th centuries, merchants from the towns in Europe began moving to the countryside, supplying money to peasants and artisans, persuading them to produce for an international market. With the expansion of world trade and the acquisition of colonies in different parts of the world, the demand for goods began growing. But merchants could not expand production within towns. This was because here urban crafts and trade guilds were powerful. These were associations of producers that trained craftspeople, maintained control over production, regulated competition and prices, and restricted the entry of new people into the trade. Rulers granted different guilds the monopoly rights to produce and trade in specific products. It was therefore difficult for new merchants to set up business in towns, so they turned to the countryside. In the countryside, poor peasants and artisans began working for merchants. As you have seen in the textbook last year, there was a time when open fields were disappearing and commons were being enclosed. Cottagers and poor peasants who had earlier depended on common lands for their survival, gathering their firewood, berries, vegetable, hay, and straw, had to now look for alternative sources of income. Many had tiny plots of land which could not provide work for all members of the household. So, when merchants came round and offered advances to produce goods for them, peasant households eagerly agreed. By working for the merchants, they could remain in the countryside and continue to cultivate their small plots. Income from proto-industrial production supplemented their shrinking income from cultivation. It also allowed them a fuller use of their family labor resources. Within this system, a close relationship developed between the town and the countryside. Merchants were based in towns, but the work was done mostly in the countryside. A merchant clothier in England purchased wool from a wool stapler and carried it to the spinners. The yarn thread that was spun was taken in subsequent stages of production to weavers, fullers, and then to dyers. The finishing was done in London before the export merchant sold the cloth in the international market. London, in fact, came to be known as a finishing center. This proto-industrial system was thus part of a network of commercial exchanges. It was controlled by merchants and the goods were produced by a vast number of producers working within their family farms, not in factories. At each stage of production, 20 to 25 workers were employed by each merchant. This meant that each clothier was controlling hundreds of workers. The coming up of the factory. The earliest factories in England came up by the 1730s, but it was only in the late 18th century that the number of factories multiplied. The first symbol of the new era was cotton. Its production boomed in the late 19th century. In 1760, Britain was importing 2.5 million pounds of raw cotton to feed its cotton industry. By 1787, this import soared to 22 million pounds. This increase was linked to a number of changes within the process of production. Let us look briefly at some of these. A series of inventions in the 18th century increased the efficacy of each step of the production process: carding, twisting and spinning, and rolling. They enhanced the output per worker, enabling each worker to produce more, and they made possible the production of stronger threads and yarn. Then, Richard Arkwright created the cotton mill. Till this time, as you have seen, cloth production was spread all over the countryside and carried out within village households. But now, the costly new machines could be purchased, set up, and maintained in the mill. Within the mill, all the processes were brought together under one roof and management. This allowed a more careful supervision over the production process, a watch over quality, and the regulation of labor, all of which had been difficult to do when production was in the countryside. In the early 19th century, factories increasingly became an intimate part of the English landscape. So visible were the imposing new mills, so magical seemed to be the power of new technology that contemporaries were dazzled. They concentrated their attention on the mills, almost forgetting the bylanes and the workshops where production still continued. The pace of industrial change. How rapid was the process of industrialization? Does industrialization mean only the growth of factory industries? First, the most dynamic industries in Britain were clearly cotton and metals. Growing at a rapid pace, cotton was the leading sector in the first phase of industrialization up to the 1840s. After that, the iron and steel industry led the way. With the expansion of railways in England from the 1840s and in the colonies from the 1860s, the demand for iron and steel increased rapidly. By 1873, Britain was exporting iron and steel worth about £77 million, double the value of its cotton export. Second, the new industries could not easily displace traditional industries. Even at the end of the 19th century, less than 20% of the total workforce was employed in technologically advanced industrial sectors. Textiles was a dynamic sector, but a large portion of the output was produced not within factories but outside, within domestic units. Third, the pace of change in the traditional industries was not set by steam-powered cotton or metal industries, but they did not remain entirely stagnant either. Seemingly ordinary and small innovations were the basis of growth in many non-mechanized sectors such as food processing, building, pottery, glasswork, tanning, furniture making, and production of implements. Fourth, technological changes occurred slowly. They did not spread dramatically across the industrial landscape. New technology was expensive, and merchants and industrialists were cautious about using it. The machines often broke down, and repair was costly. They were not as effective as their inventors and manufacturers claimed. Consider the case of the steam engine. James Watt improved the steam engine produced by Newcomen and patented the new engine in 1781. His industrialist friend Matthew Boulton manufactured the new model. But for years he could find no buyers. At the beginning of the 19th century, there were no more than 321 steam engines all over England. Of these, 80 were in cotton industries, 9 in wool industries, and the rest in mining, canal works, and iron works. Steam engines were not used in any of the other industries till much later in the century. So even the most powerful new technology that enhanced the productivity of labor manifold was slow to be accepted by industrialists. Historians now have come to increasingly recognize that the typical worker in the mid-19th century was not a machine operator, but the traditional craftsperson and laborer. Hand labor and steam power. In Victorian Britain, there was no shortage of human labor. Poor peasants and vagrants moved to the cities in large numbers in search of jobs, waiting for work. As you will know, when there is plenty of labor, wages are low. So industrialists had no problem of labor shortage or high wage costs. They did not want to introduce machines that got rid of human labor and required large capital investment. In many industries, the demand for labor was seasonal. Gasworks and breweries were especially busy through the cold months, so they needed more workers to meet their peak demand. Bookbinders and printers, catering to Christmas demand, too needed extra hands before December. At the waterfront, winter was the time that ships were repaired and spruced up. In all such industries where production fluctuated with the season, industrialists usually preferred hand labor, employing workers for the season. A range of products could be produced only with hand labor. Machines were oriented to producing uniforms, standardized goods for a mass market. But the demand in the market was often for goods with intricate designs and specific shapes. In mid-19th century Britain, for instance, 500 varieties of hammers were produced and 45 kinds of axes. These required human skill, not mechanical technology. In Victorian Britain, the upper classes, the aristocrats and the bourgeoisie, preferred things produced by hand. Handmade products came to symbolize refinement and class. They were better finished, individually produced, and carefully designed. Machine-made goods were for export to the colonies. In countries with labor shortage, industrialists were keen on using mechanical power so that the need for human labor can be minimized. This was the case in 19th century America. Britain, however, had no problem hiring human hands. Life of the workers. The abundance of labor in the market affected the lives of workers. As news of possible jobs traveled to the countryside, hundreds tramped to the cities. The actual possibility of getting a job depended on existing networks of friendship and kin relations. If you had a relative or a friend in a factory, you were more likely to get a job quickly. But not everyone had social connections. Many job seekers had to wait weeks, spending nights under bridges or in night shelters. Some stayed in night refuges that were set up by private individuals. Others went to the casual wards maintained by the poor law authorities. Seasonality of work in many industries meant prolonged periods without work. After the busy season was over, the poor were on the streets again. Some returned to the countryside after the winter, when the demand for labor in the rural areas opened up in places. But most looked for odd jobs, which till the mid-19th century were difficult to find. Wages increased somewhat in the early 19th century, but they tell us little about the welfare of the workers. The average figures hide the variations between trades and the fluctuations from year to year. For instance, when prices rose sharply during the prolonged Napoleonic War, the real value of what the workers earned fell significantly, since the same wages could now buy fewer things. Moreover, the income of workers depended not on the wage rate alone. What was also critical was the period of employment. The number of days of work determined the average daily income of the workers. At the best of times till the mid-19th century, about 10% of the urban population were extremely poor. In periods of economic slump like the 1830s, the proportion of unemployed went up to anything between 35 and 75% in different regions. The fear of unemployment made workers hostile to the introduction of new technology. When the spinning jenny was introduced in the woolen industry, women who survived on hand spinning began attacking the new machines. This conflict over the introduction of the jenny continued for a long time. After the 1840s, building activity intensified in the cities, opening up greater opportunities of employment. Roads were widened, new railway stations came up, railway lines were extended, tunnels dug, drainage and sewers laid, rivers embanked. The number of workers employed in the transport industry doubled in the 1840s and doubled again in the subsequent 30 years. Industrialization in the colonies. Let us now move to India to see how a colony industrializes. Once again, we will look not only at factory industries but also at the non-mechanized sector. We will limit our discussion primarily to textile industries. The age of Indian textiles. Before the age of machine industries, silk and cotton goods from India dominated the international market in textiles. Coarser cottons were produced in many countries, but the finer varieties often came from India. Armenian and Persian merchants took the goods from Punjab to Afghanistan, eastern Persia, and Central Asia. Bales of fine textiles were carried on camelback via the northwest frontier, through mountain passes and across deserts. A vibrant sea trade operated through the main pre-colonial ports. Surat on the Gujarat coast connected India to the Gulf and Red Sea ports. Masulipatnam in the Coromandel Coast and Hooghly in Bengal had trade links with the Southeast Asian ports. A variety of Indian merchants and bankers were involved in this network of export trade, financing production, carrying goods, and supplying exporters. Supply merchants linked the port towns to the inland regions. They gave advances to weavers, procured the woven cloth from weaving villages, and carried the supply to the ports. At the port, the big shippers and export merchants had brokers who negotiated the price and bought goods from the supply merchants operating inland. By the 1750s, this network, controlled by Indian merchants, was breaking down. The European companies gradually gained power, first securing a variety of concessions from local courts, then the monopoly rights to trade. This resulted in a decline of the old ports of Surat and Hooghly, through which local merchants had operated. Exports from these ports fell dramatically. The credit that had financed the earlier trade began drying up, and the local bankers slowly went bankrupt. In the last years of the 17th century, the gross value of trade that passed through Surat had been 16 million rupees. By the 1740s, it had slumped to 3 million rupees. While Surat and Hooghly decayed, Bombay and Calcutta grew. This shift from the old ports to the new ones was an indicator of the growth of colonial power. Trade through the new ports came to be controlled by European companies and was carried in European ships. While many of the old trading houses collapsed, those that wanted to survive had to now operate within a network shaped by European trading companies. How did these changes affect the life of weavers and other artisans? What happened to weavers? The consolidation of East India Company power after the 1760s did not initially lead to a decline in textile exports from India. British cotton industries had not yet expanded, and Indian fine textiles were in great demand in Europe. So the company was keen on expanding textile exports from India. Before establishing political power in Bengal and Carnatic in the 1760s and 1770s, the East India Company had found it difficult to ensure a regular supply of goods for export. The French, Dutch, Portuguese, as well as the local traders competed in the market to secure woven cloth. So the weaver and supply merchants could bargain and try selling the produce to the best buyer. In their letters back to London, company officials continuously complained of difficulties of supply and the high prices. However, once the East India Company established political power, it could assert a monopoly right to trade. It proceeded to develop a system of management and control that would eliminate competition, control costs, and ensure regular supplies of cotton and silk goods. This it did through a series of steps. First, the company tried to eliminate the existing traders and brokers connected with the cloth trade and establish a more direct control over the weaver. It appointed a paid servant called the Gormasta to supervise weavers, collect supplies, and examine the quality of cloth. Second, it prevented company weavers from dealing with other buyers. One way of doing this was through the system of advances. Once an order was placed, the weavers were given loans to purchase the raw material for their production. Those who took loans had to hand over the clothes they produced to the Gormasta. They could not take it to any other trader. As loans flowed in and the demand for fine textiles expanded, weavers eagerly took the advances, hoping to earn more. Many weavers had small plots of land, which they had earlier cultivated along with weaving, and the produce from this took care of their family needs. Now they had to lease out the land and devote all their time to weaving. Weaving, in fact, required the labor of the entire family, with children and women all engaged in different stages of the process. Soon, however, in many weaving villages, there were reports of clashes between weavers and gomastas. Earlier supply merchants had very often lived within the weaving villages and had a close relationship with the weavers, looking after their needs and helping them in times of crisis. The new gomastas were outsiders with no long-term social link with the village. They acted arrogantly, marched into villages with sepoys and peons, and punished weavers for delays in supply, often beating and flogging them. The weavers lost the space to bargain for prices and sell to different buyers. The price they received from the company was miserably low, and the loans they had accepted tied them to the company. In many places in Carnatic and Bengal, weavers deserted villages and migrated, setting up looms in other villages where they had some family relation. Elsewhere, weavers, along with the village traders, revolted, opposing the company and its officials. Over time, many weavers began refusing loans, closing down their workshops and taking to agricultural labor. By the turn of the 19th century, cotton weavers faced a new set of problems. Manchester comes to India. In 1772, Henry Patullo, a company official, had ventured to say that the demand for Indian textiles could never reduce, since no other nation produced goods of the same quality. Yet, by the beginning of the 19th century, we see the beginning of a long decline of textile exports from India. In 1811 to 12, piece goods accounted for 33% of India's exports. By 1850 to 51, it was no more than 3%. Why did this happen? What were its implications? As cotton industries developed in England, industrial groups began worrying about imports from other countries. They pressurized the government to impose import duties on cotton textiles so that Manchester goods could sell in Britain without facing any competition from outside. At the same time, industrialists persuaded the East India Company to sell British manufactures in Indian markets as well. Exports of British cotton goods increased dramatically in the early 19th century. At the end of the 18th century, there had been virtually no import of cotton piece goods into India. But by 1850, cotton piece goods constituted over 31% of the value of Indian imports. And by the 1870s, this figure was over 50%. Cotton weavers in India thus faced two problems at the same time. Their export market collapsed and the local market shrank, being glutted with Manchester imports. Produced by machines at lower costs, the imported cotton goods were so cheap that weavers could not easily compete with them. By the 1850s, reports from most weaving regions of India narrated stories of decline and desolation. By the 1860s, weavers faced a new problem. They could not get sufficient supply of raw cotton of good quality. When the American Civil War broke out and cotton supplies from the US were cut off, Britain turned to India. As raw cotton exports from India increased, the price of raw cotton shot up. Weavers in India were starved of supplies and forced to buy raw cotton at exorbitant prices. In this situation, weaving could not pay. Then, by the end of the 19th century, weavers and other craftspeople faced yet another problem. Factories in India began production, flooding the market with machine goods. How could weaving industries possibly survive? And that is the end of the first part of the chapter, the Age of Industrialization. We will be uploading the next part in the next video. Until then, take care.